Juliet Cafe stood at the large hospital window, gazing down at the bustling city below. Despite the neon glow of streetlights, the slowly setting sun tinted the sky with streaks of gold and copper, as if trying to remind her that there was beauty even in the darkest moments. Yet, Juliet could hardly appreciate the scene. Her mind was consumed with worry. Room 504, across the hall, housed her frail mother, Lydia, who had dedicated her life to raising Juliet alone. Lydia had always been a lively woman, full of smiles, stories, and laughter. Now she lay in a hospital bed, weakened by an illness that demanded urgent surgery. And that surgery, from what Juliet could gather, was fiercely expensive. She pressed her palm against the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. She barely recognized herself. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, telling the story of how many sleepless nights she had spent scrounging for funds or appealing for help. Each time, the answer she got was the same. "We're sorry, we can't help you at the moment." Debt collectors never missed their due notices, though, and the hospital staff reminded her daily that she needed to pay at least part of the bill for them to proceed with the operation. The sense of helplessness weighed on her chest like a rock. All that began to change one evening when she received a call from a friend who promised her an opportunity. She had almost refused to listen, but desperation forced her to keep the phone glued to her ear. The friend had insisted that a wealthy businessman had heard about Juliet's dire situation and was willing to help. All Juliet had needed to do was show up at a certain upscale restaurant, known only to an exclusive clientele, for a meeting. She recalled that night clearly. The restaurant's name, written in graceful silver lettering, was the first sign of how different this place was from her world. Inside, the lighting was soft, the floors polished, and the air smelled like fresh lilies. Everywhere she turned, there were men in expensive suits and women in designer evening gowns. At a private corner table, Juliet found Mark King. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded a confident energy that held the entire room captive. At first, he didn't smile. She remembered thinking that his dark hair, brushed back in a neat style, matched his no-nonsense gaze. He seemed to study her when she approached, scanning every inch of her face. She almost felt like she was being evaluated, and yet she refused to break under his gaze. She told herself that no matter what, she was here for one reason, her mother. She couldn't afford to back down. Mark introduced himself in a quiet tone. Polite, guarded, even. He offered her a seat, and within minutes, Juliet wondered if they inhabited two totally different worlds. Looking at the menu, Juliet realized she couldn't possibly afford anything there. Then she realized money was the last thing she should be fretting over in that moment, given the swirling possibility that he might fund her mother's surgery. Conversation began awkwardly, mostly about her mother's health and Juliet's background, but soon Mark led the conversation to a question that made Juliet's breath catch in her throat. "How far will you go to save your mother?" The answer burned in Juliet's mind. She would do anything. There was no question. Mark pinned her with his gaze, allowing the silence to stretch. Then he laid out a proposal that would change her forever, conceive a child for him, in exchange for whatever sum was needed for her mother's treatment. Juliet's mouth went dry. She remembered stuttering some protest, trying to ask if he was serious. Mark didn't flinch. He spoke of surrogacy as a transaction, a meticulously planned arrangement. He made it painfully clear that this wasn't a romantic proposition. It was fair business. She would have enough money to ensure her mother's survival, and he would have his heir. It was as simple as that. Despite the shock, Juliet saw no other way to secure the funds quickly. In the pit of her stomach, worry twisted and turned. Who was Mark King, really? Why her? She felt like she was walking into a trap. But the memory of her mother's gasping breath and weakening condition reminded her of the impossibility of living with the alternative. She had to choose, either sign the papers and secure her mother's future or watch Lydia's life slip away day by day. When Juliet finally spoke, her response was barely audible. "I'll do it." Mark's expression remained unreadable, yet she sensed a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. They agreed to do the medical procedures at a private clinic under the watchful eye of the best doctor Mark could hire. But on the night the agreement was sealed, Mark changed a crucial stipulation. Instead of a straightforward medical procedure, he requested just one night with her. She stared at him, stunned by the abrupt shift. Yet, she found herself unable, maybe even unwilling, to voice an objection. Something about him compelled her to trust him more than reason allowed. Juliet spent the following days in a daze. Thoughts of that upcoming night tore her confidence apart at the seams. Unexpectedly, she felt a flicker of attraction against her own better judgment. Her friend insisted that Mark was not known for standard arrangements. Something wasn't adding up, but Juliet was too exhausted to investigate. She told herself she would handle it. After all, it was just one night. Her final day before the arrangement found Juliet at the hospital, reading quietly to her mother. She tried to keep up a cheery pretense, acting as though everything was under control. Lydia's eyes sparkled with gentle warmth as she carefully observed her daughter's drawn face. She asked Juliet if she was sure she was okay. Juliet only nodded and changed the subject, though she was choking inside. In the hallway, a nurse reminded her that time for the surgery was running short. "We need the deposit soon," the nurse said, apologetically. That was enough to reassure Juliet that she was making the right decision. They met at Mark's penthouse, an immaculate and luxurious space that made Juliet's breath hitch. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the city, and soaring ceilings seemed to whisper that no dream was too grand. Soft music played in the background. Mark stood at the center of the living room, pulling gently on the sleeves of his immaculate suit as he greeted her. He poured her a drink, though she barely sipped it. Her nerves were jangling, and for some reason, she didn't want to dull her senses. She wanted to remember everything if she was going to cross this line. Without preamble, Mark led her to a spacious bedroom. The night was a strange combination of tenderness and tension. She realized that despite her fear, she longed for human contact, an anchor in a life adrift with responsibilities and relentless stress. Mark's eyes were unguarded in that space, just for a fleeting moment, revealing a vulnerability Juliet had not thought him capable of possessing. Neither of them spoke much, but she could sense that, on some unspoken level, they were forging an emotional connection, however tenuous. When morning came, she expected to slip out quietly. But he was awake, waiting with warm tea, and even though few words passed between them, the look in his eyes implied that everything had changed. Yet the arrangement was clear from the start. Juliet told herself not to think about it, not to interpret that glimmer in Mark's eyes as anything more than a passing sentiment. She reminded herself repeatedly that this was not about them, but about her mother's life. Mark's promise loomed large in her mind. She would have the money, and Lydia would receive her surgery. So, Juliet steeled herself and left the penthouse, hoping that she could keep her heart locked away tight. From that point on, Mark wasted no time. Within 48 hours, the deposit for Lydia's surgery arrived at the hospital in full. Juliet nearly sobbed with relief as her mother was rushed into the operating room. She waited for hours, pacing the corridor, heart pounding. Finally, the doctor spoke the words she had been praying to hear. The surgery was a success. She was so overwhelmed she didn't question the layers of complexity that now bound her to Mark King. As the days turned into weeks, Lydia slowly began to recover, and Juliet focused on her mother's rehabilitation. She tried to push away thoughts of the night with Mark and the new reality that she might be pregnant. However, fate rarely listens to our attempts at compartmentalizing our feelings. She found herself daydreaming about the gentleness Mark had shown her, about his eyes darkening with concern when she trembled with nerves. For a man who had called this arrangement a simple transaction, he had moments of genuine warmth. She tried to convince herself that any deeper connection was a figment of her own battered heart-seeking comfort. Life took an abrupt turn when Juliet felt a wave of nausea one morning. Then another wave struck the next day. A test, quietly bought from a small pharmacy, confirmed what she had expected, yet wasn't fully prepared for. She was pregnant. She sat on the closed lid of the toilet in her cramped apartment, staring at the test result for what felt like an eternity. Shock coursed through her, followed by a strange mixture of joy and apprehension. She had agreed to this, of course, but seeing the tangible proof rocked her more than she imagined. Later that same day, Mark called. He insisted that she move to one of his properties, a large home on the outskirts of the city. "You need proper care," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. Juliet's immediate reaction was to refuse. She didn't want to leave her mother or sacrifice her independence. But Lydia herself, recovering rapidly now, encouraged Juliet. "Stay somewhere that you can focus on yourself and the baby," Lydia insisted, suspicion flickering in her eyes but overshadowed by relief that her daughter would not shoulder this pregnancy alone. Reluctantly, Juliet agreed. The house was huge, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and security cameras perched on every corner. She reminded herself that this was for the sake of ensuring the health of the child, but she still felt her spirit rattle against what resembled a gilded cage. Strangely, though, Mark visited the estate often, checking on her with a surprising tenderness. They'd go for walks in the garden where he'd offer her an arm to hold. Though she protested, she could handle herself perfectly fine. He'd bring her vitamins, fuss over her diet, and once, she even heard him argue heatedly over the phone with someone about the best obstetricians available. A warmth spread within her at the signs of genuine concern behind his so-called business arrangement. Slowly but surely, a bond formed between them. Mark's eyes intentionally stopped wandering over her with that purely businesslike approach. He began to look at her in a softer, more curious way, as if he were trying to see into her very soul. She found herself drawn into conversations with him, learning bits about his childhood, how he'd lost his own mother early and grew up with a stepfather who taught him that vulnerability was a weakness. Juliet's empathy poured forward. She realized that Mark had structured his life around controlling every possible outcome, including how his future child would be conceived. Their relationship stretched into something that no longer felt so transactional. She found she could talk to him about her hopes and fears, from the stress at the hospital to worries about bringing a new life into this world. And when they shared a quiet laugh over something one of the house staff said incorrectly or found themselves drifting closer on the garden bench, it felt natural. It felt dangerously close to a real marriage. Juliet often had to remind herself that this was not supposed to be real, that they were entangled in a contract. But illusions break eventually. One evening, Juliet began noticing peculiar things. The staff seemed to know about her schedule without her telling them. Deliveries would appear at the door for items she had only casually mentioned. She started suspecting that Mark was monitoring her in more ways than he let on. Her suspicion grew one afternoon when she browsed her phone for baby gear. Moments later, an assistant appeared, courtesy of Mark, offering those exact items. It was too exact, too perfect. It was like someone had read her mind. At first, she brushed it off as coincidences. Then, she thought that maybe Mark was just going the extra mile to ensure her comfort. Late one night, however, she found a locked room at the end of a hallway. A single slip of paper pinned to the wall outside read, "Security Office." Her heart pounded. She had never been invited in, never even told about it. In a flicker of curiosity, and perhaps fear, she pressed her ear to the door. No sound emerged, but she could see faint light beneath the door. Slipping away, she tried to quell her anxiety. Maybe it was simply a standard feature in an estate like this. But the niggling sense of being watched didn't fade. She decided to confront Mark with gentle questions about the staff, about the house's security system. He answered soothingly, claiming that he only wanted to guarantee she was safe and well. Still, something remained unsettled in the pit of her stomach. This lingering disquiet pushed her the next day to investigate the estate while Mark was away on a business trip. She made up an excuse to the staff that she was looking for a quiet spot for reading. Then she approached the locked security office. She noticed a code pad near the doorknob. Fear beaded her brow. There was no feasible way to open it without the code. She was about to abandon the plan when she realized an old, second door on the other side of the room's exterior wall. It led in from the back garden. The door was locked, but it looked simpler than the new front entrance. She tested it, and sure enough, it opened with a slight jostle. Inside, Dim lights glowed over multiple screens. Her heart kicked violently against her ribs when she saw what they displayed. Feed after feed of live video from every corridor in the house, from her bedroom, from the garden paths, even from the hospital when she had visited Lydia. She realized Mark had installed a system of constant surveillance that tracked her every move. The weight of betrayal pressed in on her so heavily that she had to brace herself against the wall. The Mark she had begun to trust had built a cage around her, recorded her life as if she were a documentary subject. She felt objectified, deceived. Rage and heartbreak churned violently in her chest. She left the office in a daze, her mind spinning on how to confront him. When Mark returned from his trip that evening, he found Juliet sitting stiffly in the living room, her face a cold mask of disappointment. He noted the tension, the tear tracks that had dried on her cheeks, and demanded to know what was wrong. She pushed back her fear and demanded the truth. She told him what she had seen, all of it, her words trembling with hurt and fury. For a moment, Mark's face drained of color. He tried to explain that he had security to protect her, to ensure no one threatened her or their unborn child. He had lost so many people before, he explained that he was desperate not to lose Juliet or the baby. But to Juliet, there was no justification for creeping so deeply into her personal life. She felt violated. She had to know if everything, his tenderness, his concern, their moments of closeness, was real or just part of his controlling behavior. Their argument erupted into accusations and pleas. She told him that she could not live under the watchful eye of cameras, that she needed her agency. Mark painfully insisted that he had never meant to betray her, but the damage was done. Juliet stormed off to her room, ignoring his pleas to let him explain further. She felt anger and heartbreak roil deep in her stomach, fearful of the toll it might take on the unborn child. A tearful phone call to Lydia followed, where Juliet confessed the heartbreak and confusion she felt. Lydia, though still weak, pleaded with her not to give up on Mark too soon, reminding her that trust can be rebuilt if there is real love. Yet, Juliet wasn't convinced. Romance was never the foundation of this arrangement, and it was foolish of her to believe it had changed completely. Days passed in frosty silence. Mark didn't leave the estate. Juliet stayed mostly in her room. She was torn, each day grappling with the question of whether to leave or give Mark a chance to prove himself. The baby was a reminder that perhaps it wasn't just about her anymore. Mark tried multiple times to apologize, to bring her small gifts, to say soothing words. But the simplest request from Juliet remained unanswered. Remove the cameras, show me you trust me enough to do the same. He hesitated, citing threats from the outside world, citing all the reasons that it protected her, not harmed her. She felt he was missing the point. Everything came to a heart-pounding head one night when Juliet was awoken by severe pain in her abdomen. Fear jolted her from sleep, and she realized something was wrong. She stumbled out of bed, calling for help. Mark, having heard her from across the hall, dashed into the room. The staff scrambled, and within minutes, her face was slick with sweat, her limbs trembling. She feared for the life growing inside her. Mark scooped her into his arms without hesitation, rushing her out to his waiting car. He barked orders at the staff to call the doctor as he sped toward the nearest hospital. Terror shot through Juliet's veins as the pain refused to subside. Mark's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, and she could see in his eyes a fear that stripped away all his usual composure. In that moment, she realized that he might truly care more than she ever dared to believe. When they arrived at the hospital, Mark practically carried her inside, shouting for emergency assistance. Doctors rushed her into a room, hooking her up to monitors. The world around Juliet blurred in a haze of fluorescent lights and frantic voices. Mark was forced to wait outside, pacing the hallway like a caged lion. Time slowed to a crawl. Eventually, the doctor emerged, explaining that Juliet had experienced significant stress that triggered early arrival symptoms. They needed to stabilize her and the baby. Mark's eyes shone with relief, but the tension in his features remained. Over the next few hours, Juliet lay in the hospital bed, tubes in her arm, drifting between exhaustion and pain. She saw Mark standing vigil at her bedside. His voice was wrought with emotion as he whispered apologies for the surveillance, for controlling her. He confessed that he never set out to betray her trust, but he had learned from life that if he didn't orchestrate everything, he might lose the people he cared about. Juliet, too weak to argue, just listened. Tears slid down the sides of her face. She realized that Mark King was just as scarred by his past as she was. Their arrangement might have begun as a transactional deal, but a flicker of something real had grown. Could it survive the betrayal and the fear? Though she had survived the ordeal, the doctors insisted on bed rest for at least a few days. Mark didn't leave her side. He canceled all his meetings, all his obligations, and sat by her, holding her hand. Nurses and doctors flitted in and out, offering medication and checking her vital signs. Mark spent long moments gazing at Juliet, like he wasn't sure if she might vanish if he looked away. She found it hard to stay angry in those moments, witnessing the gentle way he stroked her hair or pressed kisses to her fingertips. After a few days, her condition improved enough that she was allowed to return to the estate. Before they left, Mark made a surprising announcement. He had called a security firm to dismantle the camera system, except for the perimeter fences. No more hidden surveillance. Juliet watched him carefully, unsure if she fully believed him, but something told her he was finally letting go. Back at the estate, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The strange tension in the staff's eyes disappeared, replaced by understanding nods as Juliet walked around the grounds without fear of being followed. Mark tried to respect her space so that she could decide for herself whether or not to stay. He spent his days ensuring her mother had the best aftercare at a nearby rehabilitation center. At night, he would knock on her door lightly, sometimes bringing her a warm drink, sometimes just looking in to check if she needed anything. Over time, their conversations began again, tentatively at first, but eventually they shared waves of laughter and gentle confessions. Step by step, trust began to flicker back to life between them. One evening, some weeks later, Juliet stood on the balcony that overlooked the lush gardens. The moon hung heavy and bright, illuminating the estate with a pale glow. She still wore loose clothes, chosen carefully for her growing belly, but tonight there was a certain radiance to her face. Mark appeared behind her, his presence gentle and diffident, as though asking for permission to stand near her. She nodded wordlessly. Together, they gazed at the moon in companionable silence. "I'm sorry again," Mark said quietly, voice carrying an earnestness so different from the distant man she first met in the restaurant all those months before. "I know I can't take back what I did or how I controlled your life, but I want you to know." He paused, searching for the right words. Finally, his eyes locked onto hers. "You're more important to me than any plan. I never want to lose you." Juliet's chest tightened, heart pounding. She knew there were no easy answers, that they still had a lot to work through. Yet a cautious warmth welled inside her. "If we're moving forward," she whispered, "it has to be together, built on honesty. No secrets." Mark nodded slowly, transfixed by her. Then, as though making a solemn promise, he gently placed his hand on her belly, where a life neither of them had planned on creating had formed a bond between them. She inhaled, and for once didn't step back, didn't flinch away from the closeness. Yet in that tranquil moment, a swirl of doubt lingered in the back of her mind. Her mother was recovering. The cameras were gone. Mark had promised a new leaf. But illusions can be resurrected with the slightest misstep. Though she wanted to trust him, she had learned that trust was fragile, easily cracked by a single betrayal. In time, she would find out just how genuine Mark's change of heart was. For now, she let her eyes drift to the shining moon and tried not to dwell on how swiftly remaining secrets could surface. Whether or not their future truly glowed with promise or hovered on the brink of yet another heartbreak was something that only time could reveal. As the night deepened and the conversation waned, the quiet admission of mutual affection hung in the air. Suspended between the possibility of real love and lurking uncertainty, Juliet tightened her hold on Mark's hand. Somewhere in the darkness stretched the knowledge that everything could change again in a single moment. Even so, the stirrings of a new life within her offered a promise of hope, that perhaps, despite mistakes committed and fears unmasked, she and Mark might discover something worth saving. And as the hush of midnight enveloped them, Juliet dared to believe that, with courage and honesty, they might defy the odds and build a future stronger than any broken trust.